Uh, Today we have the pleasure of launching the first distinct UniFi product since UniFi was first developed back in 2005. The UniFi portfolio and project management web application has had many features added to it over that time, obviously, but as a distinct, well, we did have an on-site product, I should say, released as well during that time. But this is the first new product for quite some time. Not saying that the core product hasn't had many new features that we've developed during that period, but this is quite exciting for us. So we've got a new product name, and we're launching it today to the world. And that product is called UniFi Chrysalis, because as you'll see when I show you what it does, it's all about taking the data that you've captured into UniFi and transforming it into something of a butterfly effect for your projects, one that can move them in the right direction, not the one that builds the storms, but that calms them down. Okay, so before I jump into the elements of the new product, what I'm going to do is just take a step back and look at where the first stages of someone looking to use UniFi Chrysalis would need to focus on to get that benefit. And to do that, I'm doing a bit of a retake or a refresh of the webinar I did 2 weeks ago, which was the second webinar in the UniFi 22 series release, which is where I built 3 applications, each one taking roughly 10 minutes. And the last one of that was a cash flow application. And this was it here. And so this is the start of the journey to UniFi Chrysalis, where this is hitting UniFi directly. I'll give you some models in a moment to understand the data flows. But this is a application representing the time-phased earned profile of a series of projects. And what you can see in the visual here is a series of projects that have all sort of taken place over around, let's say, 18 months. And that's the majority of projects. And then these characteristics out here have taken a while, with this outlier, the one where there's a truck crash with an avalanche down the mountain at the same time, lingering it on. And so these are the sorts of visualizations of data that enable you to then start questioning why. And the Chrysalis product, it starts to explain the why for you, and starts to look at your in-flight projects and sees if there's any characteristics in those in-flight projects that it might need to advise you of, to say this is probably going to have the same effect. And so what we did in our second webinar is a sort of first step in the road of being able to leverage the concepts of this new product. And so, yeah, that webinar is available online. You can request access to the video that shows how that was built. The other 2 dashboards built with it for you to review. But this is something to keep in mind when I go through the actual product that I'm going to demonstrate. Now, we need to take one further step back from this and just look at the data sets that exist in UniFi. And to put that in context, I'm just going to give you the first graph of the day. And it's this one, which we did show in the last webinar as well. But I'll just take you through this concept first. So UniFi is a portfolio and project management application. It's web-based. It will run your portfolios and deliver them, assist you in delivering them across those functional areas that you can see on the slide there, with data sources for those functional areas coming either directly into the interface itself or coming from third-party products. And so you have this massive data feed coming in into so many sources coming into one governance source of truth out. And it's about leveraging that source of truth out. Now, the complications in leveraging that is where you get to the right-hand side of this. For an individual project, no complications at all. For a portfolio of works, in-flight reporting, no problems at all. But when you start to get insights, when you want to start to get parametric estimates, when you want to start to troubleshoot and get the lessons learned from the past to tell me what's happening on my current in-flight projects, that's where we need to start to manipulate the data again. And that's where we're at today. So it's more around this integrated AI sort of layer that we're going to talk about with UniFi Chrysalis. And that's the next step of the puzzle. But if you don't have the semantic model and the ability to get that model and that data set out into that model, you're not going to be able to get to first base. You can't do this just using this collection of data sets over here. Plus, you'll struggle to run your portfolio of projects when you've got disaggregated data. And so the importance is to get that first element to work. And I just wanted to labor the point there a little bit into this webinar, where I just look at so this particular launch is around project controls and on major engineering pieces of work. However, I'm also going to talk about how it could be done from a building cost management perspective. And then really the sky's the limit on what you can use this functionality for. But first we need to know, what are we capturing and what's the workflow in UniPhi to capture that? And how does that make sure we have this governed source of truth out the door? And so if we just step into a UniPhi deployment for a moment, this is one that's set up for what we call major projects. So it's a discrete standalone deployment to run a project or a program of works or a portfolio of activities focused around an outcome, like an airport or a series of road programs or a new rail line, etc. And within that, the projects is now activities. And so you can see under this WBS, we've got packages and we've got activities. And so that structure is set up. And then one of the first keys around that structure is it's resource loaded. And it's resource loaded over time. And so the first webinar that I did in this series, UniPhi 22, we've rewritten all of the interfaces for this to make it much more streamlined. And if I go into this work package ABC activity, you'll see quite a lot of detail, quite a lot of data being captured across people. I can do that against classifications as well. That pivots into percent for that allocation, cost and revenue as well. And I can baseline that information, being the key element here, baselining it through the snapshotting functionality. And, Bob's your uncle, I've got myself a baseline resource loaded plan. Now, there's a lot going into that. Before you just do this effort-based phasing, where you're looking at hours per week and standard hours and you're getting that time phased, these people will need rates. And so then UniPhi's rates library comes into effect. So we can see here, we've got people, they have classifications. We're going to leverage those classifications, or we're going to leverage custom fields associated to the people to do our Chrysalis application. So we need to categorize these people. Now, we can't rely on a standard classification or standard categorization. So we need to then transform those categorizations into a classification. And what we've done in UniPhi 22 is we've used our knowledge of the data model to know where people are likely to place that information. And then we've added a layer of complexity where we use commentary and issues raised on projects to further refine that classification, because we need to make sure that the standardization is correct if we're going to be able to use it for insights. But it's worth noting here some of the complexity around this sort of stuff. So for example, there's an effective date over here. And so what that means is if I change the rates here, and if I backdate the rate change, say it was from the 1st of July, a new financial year in Australia, and I update these rates for inflation, which I can do via an index and a classification, or I can change the classification and I'll automatically update. When I hit save, you can see it gives me a little message. Actuals costs are being recalculated. This may take a few minutes. So often what seems like a very trivial thing is actually more complex than you think. And so when I'm looking at that, what it's doing now is it's going away and it's actually calculating the rates in various contexts. So from an actuals perspective, they need to be updated for timesheet entries. But even those timesheet entries have contractual implications. And so in UniPhi, there's a timesheets section. There's a timesheet audit history. So we don't just update the data, we create a transaction record of it. So we adjust it like a debit and a credit. If it was 8 hours, it's now 10. There's an additional 2 so that we know it was 8 and it's now 10. If the rate was $100, it's now 110. We give it an extra 10 so we know that it was 100 and we have this history that we can transparently present. Then there's all the rules around contracts and all that sort of issue. So when you go into the resource rate history, one of the things you'll see is the ability to put in how many hours a week you're allowed to bill according to the contract. And then what UniPhi does, and there's other things you can do for other elements of contractual complications, multiple rates and things like that. What it will do is it will take and what's billable and what's not billable. So you can flag a task as billable or non-billable. So then when it generates an invoice or generates a cost to the client, it'll take that into account. So what it does is it transposes all of that information that sits in the timesheet audit into what we call a contractual billable table. And then when you raise an invoice, it captures that as a snapshot of what you've actually had at that point in time, because that can change. you can roll back a timesheet, you can change the rate history like I just did, and all of that data changes. And then you can compare one to the other and present to the client the fact that, you know, extra hours booked for that time period, or the rate was incorrect and it was changed, and this is why the amount of cost on the project has changed. So all of that data is being managed for you, much more complex and much more dynamic than what you would traditionally think when you just build these things in a spreadsheet, and far more transparency around how things change from one period to the other that relate to the past periods, that relate to time in the past. And so once that engine is driving and we have timesheets being captured, we have our fully loaded resource plan, we have our invoicing, and we also have our time progress. So when we go into here, we've got a work package that has a suite of deliverables that are going to be released at milestone stage gates. And when they do, they're going to earn progress. That all adds up into a very simple dashboard that drives a huge amount of progress on these projects and pushes things forward. So that's that UniPhi being the engine room of day-to-day project management, project controls, commercial management on a small project to a complex project. And so we're seeing these sorts of statistics coming through, and I can go and have a chat to the person managing package ABC and understand why, you know, CPI and SPI and these particular activities is not very good. And maybe it's constant design changes and variations with clients we're missing out on. Maybe it's, over servicing, maybe it's redesign work, whatever it is, we can find out. And typically as early as possible. So that means that that project runs along and I have all of that information to hand, kind of like the S-curves at the start of this presentation with the cash flow. I know that that was the way the project was earned. That was the progress profile. And typically for similar collections of projects, we saw when we looked at that in that chart, where it's gone, get rid of the zoom thing, that is common. And so typically it's within this range. We can profile out projects with that common and then look for characteristics that cause this blowout. And that's the next step of the puzzle, next step of the journey. And we can do that with cash flow. We can do it with earned value profile of tasks, and we can do it with cost implications of those things. And then the further detailed you go, if you start to track the issues that led to that, we can see those same issues bubbling up on an in-flight project and flag them as being something you need to look out for, as something that drives the profile into these outer regions. So when you're back here at 30 and 40 and even 20%, you're getting that type of data coming back at you through the UniPhi Chrysalis interface. So hopefully that was pretty quick, but hopefully that makes sense. The main thing to keep in mind, not necessarily the nuts and bolts, is that most of the people in this webinar are users of UniPhi. There's some people being introduced to it first time, but most people are users. What are you using it for? What good data sets do you have? You will then be able to take advantage of the Chrysalis environment to aggregate and transform that information. So if I go into the next couple of slides, this is the breadth of information possible. So we've got not just effort, not just milestones, not just progress, but we've got RFIs, we've got design issues, we've got daily diaries, we've got defects. All of those things have photos, they have associated people and contractors and clients associated to them that all add up to a mix of information you can start to analyze. And all of that is distributed into the UniPhi platform. As it says here, captured at the point of work. Now, many of our clients will have multiple instances of UniPhi. Now, for those who don't on this call, don't log off now. It doesn't matter. You can transform just your UniPhi data in the one database. It's even easier, but it's still valuable, and I'll explain why. So it's this piece of the puzzle that we're sorting. Now, admittedly, the driver of it was originally we need to get information out of, some clients have over 30 UniPhi databases into one so that we can do this sort of work. But in the process, when we first did that, obviously we noticed that trying to standardize in here with users standardizing doesn't give them the flexibility of managing their project the way they want to manage their project. So UniPhi's got a lot of flexibility in it. You can create your own WBS, your own cost breakdown structure, your own profiles of classifications of people. But we should be able to glean from that as an intelligent system and extract and transform, emphasis on the word transform, that stuff. So this is the new product. This is where the caterpillar gets the incubator and it's going to come out the other end and be a beautiful butterfly. And in that, what we've done is we for some of these high profile projects, we go, okay, so what was this project all about? And we ask a large language model about it. We're not giving it any information other than, hey, this Sydney Metro, Sydenham to Bankstown line, what was that all about? So there's nothing confidential in that. We all know that line's about to be launched. Tell us about what you know about it. And often the internet will have a whole range of specifications and knowledge that we can bring in and add to our data set to give it a frame of specification that we present in the end to the end user to say, I need to know about metro lines that were built on brownfield sites. We know that was one, and what its characteristics were. So that's that top section, giving it public context. Then what we've used, and this will differ from problem to problem, but for this particular exercise, we've used the uniclass standardization for engineering tasks and engineering roles. And so what happens is all of the tasks and the people that exist in here get reclassified into a standardized UniPhi class for resources and activities in this engine and popped into this lake for consumption down the line. And while that sounds, well, what that does is it actually simplifies then the analysis of that information down the line. Using just the UniPhi extracts via the API that are called JSON is actually really complicated, and it limits our capability to what I did last week, which is fairly simplified apps that just look at project-specific information, some portfolio information. But this, because of the lack of standardization, this thing takes it to the next level. And in doing so, we use some new technology that makes this perform a lot quicker and therefore a lot easier to interrogate. All right, that's for later. So then what I'm going to do, no, actually that isn't actually, so to get this thing, this transformation thing to work, there's a bit of work by you guys, the end user. And so what we've done is we've built an interface, which I've only got screenshots of at the moment. I never like to present through screenshots. I like to show you the real thing, but this is the screenshots of some of the things. So on this screenshot, what you see is a ability to create a connection. So this will sit in the UniPhi ecosystem, but it'll be your own container. Each client will have their own container, and you'll be able to interface with your UniPhi databases and drop them into your container that no one else has access to. And when you click add deployment, there's a whole authentication piece that needs to be set up. So there's some work to do with your IT boffins to collaborate around that, but it's using our Entra ID and security framework to access your UniPhi deployments. And so if you were the company that had 35 deployments, you'd be able to add 35 deployments in here. If you've got one, you just add one. And it gives you some information about the transformation. So as soon as you've added that, it'll use our standard transformation engine to transform that into those uniclass elements. Now, as an example, just to pause there for some of the people on the call, you could also do this, and our next phase of development for doing this is on elemental structures, which are cost structures. So if I just quickly pivot into the UniPhi application again, and we look at this construction database, and if I go to the cost module, there are various elemental standards and elements of the buildings. We're talking about buildings now. There's various elemental standards. So even the standards can't agree on what the standards are. This is our problem. But if you pick one, and I'm going to do the Australian National Public Works Commission standard, it'll have a structure to it, and you'll be capturing lots of projects against that structure. Now, one of the challenges in that game is this is how we estimate. And during feasibility and design phases, the client will be getting an estimate that breaks it down into these elements. And then when you go to market, they'll tender by trade, and those trades will go across those elements. And so what this transformation engine will do is two things. One, it will be able to standardize where you've got different elemental structures, so NRM versus NPWC versus BCIS, and it'll look at that data and the way it's described in its source systems and reclassify the amounts into the standard that you want to benchmark on, which could even be your own creation. And then the other thing it will do is it will take trade-based information, if you've got enough data sent to you through that trade, to reclassify that trade information across the elements so that you are able to not just get elemental benchmarking on estimates, but elemental benchmarking on tendered price. And then if you use the UniPhi platform against those trades, you'll get the retransformed elemental cost at completion. which will include all the variations. And then you can choose which part of the life cycle phase is the best one for you to benchmark on. It might be that you're just doing feasibility analysis and using those estimates. It could be that you're doing whole of life costing, or you're doing new estimates from a parametric model, and you'll be able to pick and choose. So that's another example of how this transformation engine will take standard data out of UniPhi that isn't quite standard and reclassify it into a solid standard that you can use. And the way to do that will basically be to set up and add these deployments and get all the authentication. And then when you get to the next page, you'll then be able to tell the system a little bit more. So a long description about the project or the collection of projects. You can map metadata fields that exist across activities into standardized selections for task-based, discipline, zone. So that, remember, back on the engineering ones now, contract phase, commercial, etc. And so that's telling it where to find information, and that'll expand and expand over time. So that's you training the model on your data. And again, this model is self-contained in your container. It's not being sent anywhere. It's being, you're using your intellectual property and your knowledge of the industry and your data, and then creating an algorithm that already exists, but getting it to be optimized around that information. And then from a person perspective, you'll be able to do the same thing, where we've trawled the system and found resource classifications, have mapped it or identified in your system, for example, accounts payable, and saying, I don't know where this goes. And you can say, oh, that's actually this uniclass role. And so you'll select the drop down and map it to a uniclass role. And so there's 69 disciplines in the UniPhi transformation that haven't been mapped in this particular example. And so they're three interfaces that an admin person, a data admin person, will be able to use to facilitate improved accuracy. And then one of the things that spits out the other end is a confidence level around the reclassification of data, because it is normalized and it is anonymized. And so, you want to know how good it is and where that classification is. And in part of the setup, we can actually turn on non-anonymized information for you to troubleshoot your own information in your own container. But by default, at the end, it'll come out as an anonymized data set. All right, so if I go back to it should be the next slide. And so what we've done then is we've gone from these UniPhi deployments here in different areas of the world, or your own single one, and into this chrysalis layer that's transformed all of that information. And the way it's done that is we call it a bronze level, where it takes all the data out of UniPhi raw. We merge all the endpoints, and then we reclass everything and transform it. And that's when it's gold. And that's when it's ready to be consumed. Now, at the moment, we have left this space for you guys. So what you get access to is a pristine data set that's structured in the way that you want. At the moment, centered around engineering classifications, but rapidly building out into cost management classifications, life cycle phase classifications. Could be the REBA architectural life cycle phase, and you want to know how long each phase stays. Could be milestone based around how long does a council development application take on average, and all those sorts of things. So the engine will change over time for different users in different industries, taking the data out of UniPhi, transforming it into a common set of standards, so that you might have called it DA on one and development application on another. It still comes in as the standard, and we can start to interrogate and use that information. Now, that's why I did the second webinar in this series, where I showed you how to build an app in 15 minutes. This is where you'll need to then start to use your own knowledge, and it's called vibe coding. And if you use AI, but even if you just use Power BI and use data analytics in there, the power that's unlocked is software developers are really good at developing software once they know what it is that you want them to do. You are the ones that want to know what data you want to, what insights you want to get, and this is what it's going to be able to enable you to do. And so, as an example of that, in this particular exercise, following the same methodology I showed in the webinar a couple of weeks ago, this was generated in literally 7.5 minutes, based on dummy data that's gone through that transformation process to be the chrysalis out the other end. This is your butterfly. And so this has taken the data that has been transformed. It's in UniClass now. It's average cost per entry and average hours per entry. You can see that each deployment will have a name. And so these are typically projects or programs in some clients. But if yours is just one project, then this will change to being your project list in UniPhi rather than a deployment. So this is where it's transformed the nomenclature to be that dropdown is actually a deployment of UniPhi. Others will have just their straight out projects, which are available in this workspace already. So you would just tell the application to build it differently, or when you're using Power BI, select a different field. And I'll show you the Power BI interface in a moment. But yeah, this is a web application again. It's built with both separation between class and activity. It doesn't have a lot of insights in this particular application, but that's where you guys come in and you start to interrogate the structures. Now, the reason in the database Power BI thing, in here, I think it's the next slide. So that's another example of one. That's from 12 months ago, where you pick an asset and you analyze it, and it gives you a whole bunch of timelines over different stages that you're expecting for different classifications of a drafter or a traffic modeler or a tunneling engineer, etc. But in accessing that, what we've implemented is this MCP server, which tells the models that you build how this thing works, so that you don't need to necessarily know. Having said that, our API and AI work quite well together because it's really well named and the Swagger documentation is quite good, but it still gets confused sometimes. This classification in this gold UniClass is so simple. This is really just overkill. And then these will all automatically interrogate it, or, and apologies, I didn't load this before the session. You will use your own Power BI skills to do that. And it's all self-contained. It stays in the lake. It never gets published out. And so you're training it, you're building your own application within a localized environment that doesn't leave the localized environment. And so this is where you can add your intellectual property. So if you watch a lot of AI, and there's a lot out there, but a lot of skeptics around AI say where there's really value is in the niche, is in the specialization. So you've got all your data in UniPhi, it's sitting there, it's untapped. What this UniPhi Chrysalis unlocks is the ability to really leverage that analysis of it. You could do it now with the REST API, but it's 130 endpoints. It's messy, not as messy as spreadsheets and all the other applications, but all the same, it is messy. And, you need to work through all of that. But once it's in this model, it's totally clean, and you haven't had to do anything to do that, which is the key. So I'm just loading up that file for a minute. And let that person who just came in. That's my Zoom session. Not going to say much anyway. Okay. So this is the same information, just as tables. So you can see chairman, client, fittings as tunneling engineer as classification titles, and the missing hours. These are tasks in the UniClass system, and these are the endpoints that you need to manage those. They've all come from this particular query here. So it's one query that you then port into the different tables. Now there's 4 tables there instead of 130, and they've all been cleaned. And so when you expand, you get confidence matches and UniClass descriptions that you can then contain into these other endpoints of what source system, which is the project. So it could be, Western Sydney Airport or something like that. And then all of the people data, which again, names and that will be not normally available. This is the silver person ID that we can link back to if we need to. This is the UniPhi class code for that person and how confident we are that we've matched that correctly. And so you can test all of that and add it in and analyze it to see how well it thinks that has happened, and I'm coming to an area where I'm not that confident of using this stuff myself yet. But as far as that data goes, 40% confident here, 70% confident on that one. And obviously we weren't able to classify that one. And this is all on dummy data that we've made up years ago before we even thought of these concepts. And so that's how the engine will come out the other side. That's how you'll get access to it, through here or through a vibe coding Claude situation that will develop an interface for you to then get something like this. And what you should end up with is a very niche, transformed data set based on your particular problem that you're trying to solve across your portfolio, which with UniPhi we know from client to client is very broad. So each one has their own particular, which is why, going back to the Power BI, we've left this element to clients. It's likely that we'll build some out of the box applications for common ones. But our first point was to get the Chrysalis worked up. That'll be the Butterfly app. The Chrysalis has been worked up. It's now ready to be used in Anger, and we're actually rolling it out with one client with quite a lot of data from August. So I expect that engineering example to mature quite quickly. We're rolling into the cost modeling transformation straight away from the release of August 3rd, and so on and so forth from that day forward. So if you have a key piece of analysis that maybe you've even achieved a certain element of in Power BI and you want to get to the next level, reach out to us and we'll be happy to work out a framework and a time frame to add it into the Chrysalis transformation engine and have it drop into your container sometime soon. So hopefully that wasn't too abstract. In summary, going back to the very first or second chart, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about data that sits in a well-structured database with a nice API model and a semantic model that tells us things about people. So for example, we know it's a people custom field. We know it's an activity custom field. We know it's timesheet commentary. We know all this stuff. And then we correlate it using covariance analysis and other things to see how they relate and whether they can help us to this mapping table we have around a standard, which in this instance is uniclass, and say, okay, that person is definitely a tunneling engineer. That activity is definitely tunneling. And now we have a rich metadata framework around that to say, well, that was on a tunneling project that was 15 kilometers long or 5 kilometers long. It started here, it lasted for 6 months. The actual dates aren't that important. It's mainly around the timeline, the duration. And we can then start to drop that into the lake and have that for interrogation by people who know that information better than us. As usual, the Australian webinar gets the worst one because I'll have to do this twice more. So probably publish the Canadian one tomorrow after I've done through another couple of iterations. But hopefully that was of use. Please feel free to give us the feedback offline and give you half an hour of your lunchtime back if you're in the East Coast, and let you get on with your day. Thanks for joining.